Good morning, everyone. Just waiting for people to come in from the waiting room. Just give it a couple of seconds before we get underway. Okay, I think we should get started. So good morning and a very warm welcome to this first EPC update of 2022, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the EPC, and Chief Executive Fabian Zuleeg, and our special guest today, delighted to welcome back Herman van Rompuy, President of the EPC, and of course, President Emeritus of the European Council. Herman, it's great to have you with us as always. Thank you so much for finding the time to be with us. And we're going to focus today on, as the title of this session implies, facing up to the challenge of a post-COVID world. Can the EU turn fear into hope after a decade of turbulence? I'm going to try and take stock a little of where we are and the challenges that lie ahead, and what needs to be done if we are to restore a sense of optimism after such difficult and challenging years. Can we do it? How can we do it? As always, totally interactive session, questions from me to our panel, and then I hope from all of you. Your microphones are muted at the moment. If you want to join the conversation orally, please click on the raised hands button at the bottom of your screen, and I will ask you to activate just your microphone when the time comes. If you prefer to write your question, please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A, and please keep your comment or question brief so I can see at a glance what it is you want to know and who the question is for. Please, Twitter length or less would be marvelous. So, as I say, we're going to focus on the current state of the Union, where it's headed, where should it be headed, in what promises to be another deeply challenging year for Europe and indeed for the world. Let me start with the pandemic. We need to start there. We are not out of it. There are hopes now that we are moving towards the end, but we are now in its third year. Herman, do you think we can begin to draw some lessons about the things that have united the EU during the pandemic? And in some areas, we seem to have done remarkably well. In others, we've been more divided. What would you highlight in terms of lessons learned from both the unity and the divisions?
Thank you, Jacki. As you know, I always see the bright side of things. So I will stress and emphasize also what is positive. Let us not forget, first of all, that this is a global crisis. It is not a European crisis. It's a global crisis. And it's, again, an imported crisis. So we saw it on so many occasions since 2008. That's my first observation. My second is that the center of gravity of policy making, fighting against COVID, the center of gravity lies in the member states. So there, most of the measures are taken. So before starting blaming the European Union, we have to see where the competences are, and the competences on health are mainly national competences, or inside the member states, for the federal states, even regional competences. So what's now about what can we say about the European Union? It was, of course, a slow start 2 years ago, and the EU institutions had to find their place in this new world. But when we look at the results, because at the end, these are the results that count. We saw the setting up of the recovery fund. We have to say that here France and Germany played their traditional role as a motor, but the institutions, the Commission and the Council, jumped in and extended even, and they reached an agreement. We saw also during this pandemic and also from the start on an agreement on the Green Deal. So this is not a traditional recovery policy based on infrastructure, roads, ports, harbors, and so on. No, this is based on what we call now in our language the the climate and digital transition, a long-term view. We are often reproached only to look at the short-term and crisis management. This is a long-term view. The Commission and the EU institutions safeguarded the free movement of people and of goods. Of course, there were in the beginning, there were some hesitations and so on, but since more than 1 year and a half, we have free movement of goods and of people. And let us not forget the vaccination strategy. By the way, due also to the subsidies provided by the EU institutions, we could have, we have had very rapidly an effective vaccine. And then the common purchases, the joint purchases of vaccines allowed us to catch up to UK and the US and even take some lead. So what I saw also in public opinion is that people were asking for more Europe. There's not only blaming Europe, they were asking where in the beginning they asked, where is Europe? I think that the EU, within the limits of their competencies, performed rather well. Allow me two observations about the lessons we can draw. First of all, and again, I see the bright side of things. The silent majority of people were disciplined during this COVID crisis. They respected the rules. They accepted the limits to their so-called freedom. Of course, there was a minority who was not agreeing, but the overwhelming majority was very disciplined and showed respect also for their parents, their grandparents, the elderly people, simply their neighbors. So that struck me, and it's still the case. Of course, we are all fed up after 2 years of restrictions, but overall, there was a strong tendency in population to keep to respect what was agreed at the political level. And my second and last observation is about, let's say, what's happening in our political democracies. Is we saw the primacy of politics. We rediscovered that the market is not the only solution to problems we are facing, that education and health are collective goods we have to cherish. And so there is in some way a restoration of the importance of political decisions and of collective goods. Of course,
so collective solidarity, a sense, as you say, that community spirit of protecting yourself and each other, respecting the rules, and the importance of the politics has come back on what the implications of that are. Fabian, for you, in terms of the lessons learned, and Herman there pointing to a very positive report card in some areas, some less positive things. We've seen attempts to coordinate the response across the EU. As Herman said, it is about member states, but the attempts to have a more coordinated response haven't been so successful, but the recovery fund and the other things Herman mentioned have been. Your overall assessment and your lessons learned.
Thanks, and I very much agree with the comments Herman made. I think in terms of the lessons learned, I think we have to be careful because the developments which have resulted from COVID are nowhere near the end yet. We're still in the middle of a process. And I think one thing which is already clear, and maybe we should have titled this discussion differently, there isn't post-COVID. There is living with COVID in a different way. We might be getting into a different stage. But the changes which have come with COVID are structural changes. They are going to be permanent changes. We will still have the short-term impact There will still be effects on the economy, on travel, on also distributional inequality issues. But I think there's also the longer term change, which is going to be very significant, but we will have to see in what direction it will go. One thing which was already mentioned is I think there's a very different role for government now. We are back in an era of big government, intervening in lots of areas of the economy, of social life. That will have implications. It also raises specific questions for the European Union. As Herman was saying, the focus of COVID has been very much at the national level or even the regional level. So what is the role of the European Union in a new era of big government? Does this mean that we will have more being delegated back to the member states? Does it mean that we will have more powers at the European level in certain areas? For example, in the whole health sector, the pharmaceutical sector, the question of pandemic. And what impact will that have on politics and on populism? And this is one of the areas we don't know yet. We don't know whether we will see a resurgence of populism as we are emerging this acute part of the COVID crisis.
Because it is quite striking that with some notable exceptions, in fact, populists have struggled during the crisis to have the sort of messages that have worked so well for them in the past in this, as you say, I should have perhaps called it post-pandemic phase, when we go endemic and we live with COVID. How, will they be able to seize those opportunities? What needs to be done? Come back on that. Janis, complete the picture for us in terms of your overall assessment, and for you, the most important lessons.
Well, I think if we go back now almost 2 years and you have a bird's eye view on what has happened, overall, I think my assessment is also a positive one. I remember when we were having our first exchanges in the EPC update in March, April of 2020, and which we're trying to assess of what potentially is in front of us, looking at the potential challenges of this unprecedented crisis. It is a crisis which we have not witnessed in the history of the European Union. We were looking at the potential consequences, and I think that a lot of us were very fearful of what it could mean in economic terms, and social, societal, political, in all the different facets of the potential challenges which this crisis could lead to. And when we were having this very bleak picture, and I think it was very widely shared by a lot of people, also by decision makers, I think this is what made them, at the end of the day, react at the national level, as Herman was alluding to, because this was the most important level, but also at the European level. It would, out of the pressure of necessity, out of the fear of what potentially could come out of the crisis. So for me, one of the key lessons which I have learned is that the fearing the worst to happen is probably the best way of avoiding the worst to happen. So the fact that Paris and Berlin, as Herman was alluding to earlier, in May of 2020 agreed that there needs to be a joint economic reaction to the crisis, which then led to Next Generation EU, was taken out of the consideration that if that would not happen, the consequences would be immense. So you had all these ups and downs also with the procurement of the vaccine. I remember a year ago when we were all criticizing of where we stand and that we don't have enough and what is happening. And people were saying it was the wrong decision maybe to have a joint procurement. No, it was not the wrong decision. So another lesson, if you act together, it's the best way of confronting a crisis of that scale. Now, having said all that, Fabian is right. We still do not know what the consequences of the long-term consequences of this crisis will look like. I would say that in 2 or 5, maybe even in 10 years, we will be looking back at certain developments happening at that time and linking it to what happened in 2020, 21, 22. And let's see when we will get into the endemic phase, what kind of consequences we'll still be facing of the COVID-19 crisis. We'll be looking back and saying, look how that moment in time is affecting what is happening. So the final verdict is still out, and the lessons we can learn are out there. The question is whether we will in future collectively adhere to the lessons we should have learned.
Absolutely. And linked to that, Herman, in terms of how well equipped the EU is to learn those lessons, do you think, going back to Fabian's question about, and you pointed out this role, politics is back, government is back. And Fabian said it remains to be seen whether this means more goes back to member states or the EU gets a bigger role, for example, in terms of health, because you stressed at the beginning that you think the EU's done well within the limits of its competences. How do you see that debate developing in terms of, is it going to be big government as well, more looking to the EU for solutions to these cross-border issues? Or do you think we're going to see more of a return to big government at national level, which, if you like, takes away from what is done at EU level? How do you see that trend?
Mm-hmm. Could be both. It could be that there is a strengthening of public authorities at national level and more bigger role for the EU institutions. That's not contradictory. For Europe, I hope, to use the word that is a key word for this talk, I hope that if there are results coming out from the conference on the future of Europe, that a strong plea for what we call now a health union, that would be a great great result, one of them. So I think that a lot of people have discovered that we have to do more in a coordinated way. I'm not saying in an integrated way, but in a coordinated way in terms of health. Another question is, can we make this next generation EU, this recovery fund, can we make it permanent? This is a very powerful instrument. Actually, it's almost doubling the EU budget, so to speak, 500 billion euros in 3 years' time. So how can we make it permanent? Because the digital and the ecological transition is not over after 3 years, after the term of this next generation EU program. So how to continue this? Will we stop this great initiative after a few years, or will we continue? And that would be a very powerful instrument for the European Union, and also with a lot of consequences. Also for the euro.
Do you think it would be, sorry to interrupt, would you think it would be possible? I mean, the recovery fund was agreed, an unprecedented agreement in the face of crisis. When that sense of crisis recedes, do you think you can still get EU leaders to agree on those types of measures? Just a thought from you, Herman, and then I'll come back to Janis and Fabian.
Yeah, I have only one answer to that. A lot depends on what France and Germany have in mind. Mm. And of course, we will have elections in France. We just had elections in Germany with a very pro-European government. I think that in France, in any case, we will have either President Macron, who is continuing his job, or another candidate from the center-right. So there will not be an anti-European president in France, but still depends on personalities and on the, let's say, the kind of victory of the new president. But France and Germany will play a big role, and there is really a possibility that we can make this recovery fund more permanent. And that would be, as I said, and I repeat it, a very powerful instrument for the EU institutions.
But it also raises, Janis, the question when we talk about using the recovery fund, as Herman said, not for traditional things, but to build back better, to borrow the American expression, to focus on that ecological transition, that digital transition. It depends on whether the recovery fund gets used in the right way, whether it really does focus on those transitions. What is your sense? So let's focus on the economy for a while. We'll come back on some of the democratic questions a bit later in the geopolitical, but on the economy side, number one, do you believe there is a chance that that fund could be made permanent? And number two, if it can, are you confident it will be used in the right way for the right ends?
Well, if you look into all the national recovery resilience plans, you will see that they have a strong focus, as was also asked for, on aspects related to the green transition, but also the digital transition. However, one could still ask whether the amount of money being put into these dual transitions is enough, or whether even more of the funds allocated should have gone in this direction. With respect to the questions of permanence, I'm not so sure about it. I don't think that the instrument will be forgotten. That's not the issue. Because whenever you will come to a point where you will have a crisis of a sort which requires a collective economic response, you will be reminded of what you did in 2020. So this is there to stay. The question is whether this kind of permanence will be at what level it will be. And here I have my doubts, because you can already see that in a good number of countries, and it's also traditionally those who are more skeptical about these instruments, there is this argument, this is something which is ad hoc, it's very crisis related. So it's not something which should be there on a permanent basis. Just one addition to, because when we were talking about the general appreciation of the situation, I think what is interesting to witness is I have the sense, and there are polls which indicate that also, that the aspirations, the hopes, maybe also the expectations of citizens, you can also call them the silent majority, as Herman called them earlier, have risen with respect to what they expect Europe to deliver. They want Europe to deliver more. That puts the bar rather high in terms of what people expect from the EU to deliver in future. So the expectations are now, I think, even higher than they were 2-3 years ago. But at the same time, because you have high expectations, you also increasingly sense a feel of frustration, and I think also among the youth, feeling that Europe actually doesn't live up to the level of expectations they have. And that, I think, is a different, is not a new challenge, but it is a different quality of a challenge for the European Union, especially for younger generations, because there's a danger that if their expectations are not met, they feel that Europe is irrelevant, and that would be really bad news.
Yeah. But it is interesting, because normally in a time of crisis, that tendency, and we've seen it in some areas, to turn in on yourself, very much to focus on the member state level, is very strong. And yet we've seen, as you say, the opposite to some extent. People, as Herman said right at the beginning, wanting more Europe, not less, not blaming Europe, but seeing it as the solution. So maybe an interesting moment to capitalize on. But Fabian, just on the economic side again for a moment, in terms of, you have warned in many updates, conversations we've had, that we underestimate the economic impact of COVID. And as you said, not over yet. We're still in the midst of it. We're going to have to live with it. How optimistic are you that we really can bounce back better? And this question of the EU's role, and do you see any chance of the recovery fund being made permanent? Should it be?
On the question, can we bounce back better? I think the key here is that we will have to deal with the new challenges which are there. And to some extent, yes, it has been aggravated and changed by COVID, but some of the challenges pre-existed. And in particular, highlighting the sustainability, the climate change challenge, which is still an existential threat. It still is something we will need to do a lot more on. And I think that also raises questions about the kind of instruments we are going to need. We know that there's an enormous amount of investment needed, both in terms of the technological transition, which we need to go through, and the sustainability transition. Where's that investment going to come from?
Yeah.
Where's the public side going to come from? How are we going to encourage the private investment? It's going to be crucial. How do we deal with the new challenges we're seeing now with supply chains globally, with energy, with prices, with inflation?
Yeah.
How are we going to deal with the fiscal hangover, which is going to come in the end after this? And there, in all of these questions, we will have the challenge of whether we try to do this together at the European level, or whether we go back to leaving the member states to do things by themselves. And I think there's a real capacity question here, whether some of the member states can deal with these by themselves. And unless we are finding ways of doing this at the European level, we are going to fail. And that's the question for me about permanence, is to see what is it we need to deal with this new normal. And that might well be one of the instruments, but I certainly would also caution to say, by itself, it is nowhere near enough in relation to
Indeed
the
not.
kind of challenges and transformations we
Just
face.
before we move on, let me just read out a comment because it links to what we've been talking about so far from Malcolm Harbour, saying, I suggest public authorities have discovered they can act much more flexibly and deploy innovations more quickly. We need to keep up the momentum of these changes. Also, the discovery remote working can be so effective should be a big stimulus to pan-EU activity. There'll be more EU regional networking without the need for Brussels-centric management. Decentralization needs to be encouraged. Thank you, Malcolm. An interesting observation on where we are. Herman, in terms of the cost of living crisis, rising energy prices and so on, I mean, this is, many people say, going to be the defining challenge of this year, more than the health issues that we've been wrestling with for the last 2 years or so. In terms of the EU's role in this, what can it do? What does it need to do? Because this is, again, we go back, something that is very much a national area for, in many terms. Do you see a role for the EU, and do you see a public expectation that the EU needs to help find the answers to this?
Yeah, let us first look at the figures. The figures are that for the upcoming 3 years, so to speak, I'm speaking also for 21, 22, 23, overall, on average, inflation rate in the Eurozone will be around 2.5%. In 23, most forecasts, most of them, if not all of them, they give a figure of around 2%. I know that in some countries we are at 7%, mostly non-Eurozone countries. For instance, in Poland and in Hungary, we have that kind of level. Also in the UK, in the US. But speaking about the Eurozone, we have to look at the figures, and of course it is a serious problem. It's touching upon the income of people, their purchasing power, but overall, we are not in hyperinflation as some try to portray. Secondly, you said that this is a matter for the member states. In some way, inflation is a worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah.
It is not only a European one. Again, look at what's happening in the Anglo-Saxon countries. And there is one player in the EU institutions on which there is a heavy responsibility, that is the European Central Bank.
Indeed. I think I meant in terms of alleviating the impacts, for example,
Yeah,
in terms of people's insecurities, people's fears about what it means to them. The levers don't really, yes, the tools to tackle it directly, as you say, ECB, but more this issue of rising insecurities, rising inequalities.
Yeah, but you're right. If it is about, let's say, taking measures as lowering taxes on energy, for instance, or on giving some kind of compensation to people so that they can afford the huge bills of electricity and fuel. That's a national responsibility, most of it. But one of the biggest responsibilities lies with the European Central Bank. Will they do as the Federal Reserve Bank is doing now? And he's changing dramatically since yesterday monetary policy. And that's a balance that has to be to be found between fighting inflation, where that inflation has other sources than only demand pull. So there are also worldwide costs, and then you cannot tackle them with a monetary instrument. So finding a balance between tackling inflation and not killing the recovery.
Yeah.
And it's not an easy easy exercise. And you see that the ECB is struggling with that issue. By the way, I think that the ECB is much more independent than the Federal Reserve Bank. And they have also a more focused target. So for them, inflation is the key target. For the Federal Reserve Bank, it is employment and inflation. So a lot will depend on those non-elected leaders of the European Central Bank. A lot is also depending, but that's only for energy. A lot is depending on the evolution of the Ukraine crisis.
Indeed, I want to come to that in just a moment.
That we'll discuss later on. But
let's come to that next. Very quick, if you would, because I want to cover the geopolitical situation in Ukraine. I want to cover politics. There's some comments about that as well. In terms of the cost of living and the EU's role in dealing with this, and I'm thinking about, we talk about issues relating to the transitions we were talking about, just mechanism, fair, just transition mechanism, and so on. How concerned should we be, Fabian, about the social impacts of this cost of living crisis and what that might mean in terms of the EU's response? Brief ones, if you would.
I think, firstly, we should be concerned in its own right. I mean, this is a major issue for many vulnerable groups around Europe, where we will have a real affordability problem. It will mean that in a number of countries, people won't be able to heat their houses because they simply do not have the money to do so. So that impact, I think, is very important to bear in mind. The question is, what can the European Union do about it in the short term? And I think when it comes to the tools which are available to deal with it, there's very little. There is a question of also allowing the member states to take certain actions, given that it intervenes in the market. But I think there's also a longer term question we have to ask ourselves, and that's when it comes to the transformation which is required. Price is one of the key instruments. And while we wouldn't want to see this kind of volatility, these kind of hikes in prices also caused by other issues than just the market, in the long term, we have to expect that prices for energy will go up. And that will raise the question of how can we make that just? Who is going to bear the cost? Is it industry? Is it households? And if we don't answer that question, and I think this is an important one to emphasize, we are going to fail. We are not going to manage these transitions because populations will not support them.
Absolutely. Janis, you talked about raising expectations and frustrations. Do you fear that this is an area where, aside from the role of the ECB, and we've been talking about that people will look to the EU for solutions and won't find them there because they can't find them there? How do you see this challenge for Europe?
People look for solutions when it comes to the energy spike crisis, look for solutions at all levels. They're asking their governments to help them. They're also expecting that Europe will do something about them. But we were earlier discussing about the lessons learned of the COVID-19 crisis. And what you can see with respect to the energy prices crisis is that we have a fundamental difference between member states. There are some member states who believe that this is something which is periodical. It will get better in the course of 22 as we get out of winter. Others are saying, no, this is a structural phenomenon which we have to deal with also at a structural level, and we need a collective response by the European Union. So you have differences between member states, and the Commission finds itself somewhere in between, leaning probably towards the former than rather the latter. So if you don't find a solution, then that will have negative repercussions also for the EU. And that's where Fabian is right, is linked to a more fundamental debate about how are we going to deal with our energy transition? How are we going to deal with green transition? Who's going to pay for it? And you look at the discussion we've had about taxonomy, about the question of how we qualify certain sources of energy and how green they are or not. And you see how many differences there are between member states.
Okay.
And that, I think, then also has an effect on how you collectively deal to a more concrete challenge like the energy increases,
Okay,
prices increases.
yeah,
And by the
let's
way,
come.
it also potentially can foster what people will call green populism. Because so there are longer term effects of all of this, which are important. And I'm not sure that we're learning the lessons of the COVID-19 crisis when we deal with that.
Yeah, thank you very much. On the energy crisis and the link to Ukraine, and I did want to talk about how the EU should respond to this increasingly challenging and volatile geopolitical environment we find ourselves in. Just to mention, the EPC has published an outlook paper put together by the whole of the Europe in the World team that looks ahead and gives an overview of the main developments in the geopolitical arena and looks at what the EU is likely to do, what it should do. Do recommend you take a look at that. And Nico Keppins in our audience says on the geopolitical situation, how is it possible that instead of facing together the challenge of COVID, but also climate change and other global challenges, national leaders focus on power games? See the Ukraine crisis, tension around Taiwan. Instead of using all resources to solve problems, more is going to weapons to divide. I mean, this whole question of the return of the strong men of politics, of power battles. Herman, how do you see the Ukraine crisis, the EU's response, which has been very mixed so far and rather confusing to see where it's going with all of this because of the differences between member states? How do you see Ukraine and how do you see the bigger geopolitical picture?
Mm-hmm. Last question is the most difficult one. We have not created, the European Union has not created the Ukraine crisis. Let us not forget, when you make a global assessment, looking at Ukraine, we are the victims of nostalgic nationalism coming from Russia. It is not new. When I was in office, Ukraine was high on the political agenda since Maidan, since the revolution of Maidan by the end of 2013, and then we had 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, with the destabilization of eastern Ukraine, and it was the end of the strategic partnership with Russia. I never forget that a meeting with President Putin and President Barroso, the three of us, by the end of 2013, and it was clear at that moment that it would be the last meeting we had together, and we had EU-Russia summits twice a year. With the United States, we had every 2 years, but with Russia, we had every 6 months. So this was the end of this relationship, and then a few months later, they were thrown out of the G7, and so we are in confrontation with Russia since then. Of course, we had in 2015 the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements were concluded by President Putin, by Chancellor Merkel, François Hollande, the president of France at that time, and the Ukrainian president, without the Americans. It was a very special formula. These Minsk agreements were not implemented by Russia, and to some extent also were not fully implemented by Ukraine. But we knew that if there is no solution for Ukraine, we can never have some kind of normalization in our relations with Russia. Now, last weeks, Russia is building up the pressure with an old issue, an issue coming back from 2008, the possibility of a NATO membership of Ukraine. There's no support for this inside the NATO, but when you push them and we ask us, can they be a member at some moment in time? Of course, we will say yes, but nobody's thinking on a membership on the short or in the medium term. So there are direct relations of negotiations between Biden and Putin, between Lavrov and the minister Blinken of the United States. I see the last days that Europe is again coming into the game with a replica of the Normandy formula of contacts between France and Russia. By the way, we miss a lot Chancellor Merkel in these days because she had a direct contact with Putin, and I think with Merkel in place or still in office, this bypassing of the European Union would never have taken place. But let me just make one final comment, Jackie, because you asked about the geopolitical context.
I wanted to say, do you see this as an example of the EU struggling in this geopolitical arena or not?
But we struggled with Ukraine and Russia also in the crisis in 2013, 2014. After the annexation of Crimea, it took us almost 6 months before we could agree on strong and tough economic sanctions. The downing of the MH17, remember that airplane above with so many casualties, mostly Dutch people, that was the trigger. Then we could agree easily. I had not even to convene a European Council for deciding on this. It was so obvious that we had to take action, but we struggled during months. So regarding Russia and also regarding China, we have not a common strategic view. In crisis times, we can agree on sanctions. We agreed on sanctions in 2014, as I said, after the downing of the MH17. And we prolonged those sanctions all the time because we have to prolong it every 6 months. But there is not a really common position, and that's unfortunate. But my intention was, Jackie, to add one other comment. Geopolitically, we are living now in a very special time. A dangerous time of nostalgic nationalism. For Russia, it's very obvious. They are facing a demographic decline of the first degree. They have not a modern economy. They have gas and an army. In China, you have also some kind of nostalgic nationalism, and Taiwan is even more dangerous in the longer term than and Hong Kong is
Indeed. We need to,
already settled. In the United States, we had Trump. It could be that Trump one day will return. Make America back again. In the UK, you have also that kind of nostalgia. It was take back control with the emphasis on back. So this is new. All this is new. Less dangerous in the UK and in the US, dangerous in Russia, and dangerous in China, and they are allies.
Let me link that to the question I wanted to ask you about populism, but also about hope, because I do want to come back to hope. We're talking today about how do we turn fear into hope. But John Palmer, just linked to this, says there have been persistent reports that the French and German governments want to strengthen the European Union's role in the field of security and maybe defence. What concrete initiatives does the panel think might emerge from this? Will the prospects for a stronger EU defence and security policy ultimately depend on whether or not a NATO skeptic, maybe NATO hostile President Trump re-enters the White House after the next election? Janis, in broad terms, how do you see Ukraine as a test of the EU's capacity in this geopolitical world of the strong man, some of the issues that are highlighted in the EPC Outlook paper? Is this a big test of the EU? And if it is, do you think it will pass it? Because I think, as Herman said, when something happens, yes, we can agree. We trigger sanctions. It's in the build-up that we look weaker and less effective. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it is a test. In the short term, we will not pass it. And I'm not sure whether in the long term we will take the right lesson. And it's no coincidence that Putin and his associates are putting this pressure on Europeans, but also on the US at this point in time. They see that in Europe, we have divisions. We do not know what our collective strengths could look like, how we should collectively act. We have no common strategic culture. We're still struggling with the effects of COVID. We have a new German government, which is a very complicated government. In the case of Russia, Ukraine, you can see that there are divisions within the government. You have a chancellor who still needs to find his way. He is not comparable to what Angela Merkel had been. It's also probably too early to ask this from him. And I could add on to that. So there is this collective weakness we have, which is now being tested. And this is being done on purpose. And the same goes with respect to the US. I think the ultimate aim of probably Moscow at this point in time is to push the Americans further out of Europe, to lessen their readiness to commit to Europe. Now, the question is, will this crisis move in that direction or move it in the opposite direction? But this is the attempt to push the Americans further out of Europe, and also to test not only today and tomorrow, but also when the next person will enter the White House, if it's not Biden remaining, of how he or she will deal as being president with the public pressures at home of saying, why should we engage in Europe if we have other areas, especially in Asia, where we need to engage ourselves? Yeah. So all this is testing us and seeing how far we can go, and we are showing that we are divided. So I think that unfortunately, the ability or inability to strengthen our role when it comes to foreign security and defense policy will continue to prevail.
Thank you. Fabian, a thought from you on this, and then I want to come to the broader political environment and picking up on the point about nostalgic nationalism and linking that to the challenge of populism. Fabian.
I think the difficulty in these highly politically contentious areas is that if you want to work together at the European level, you have to face the trade-offs together, and you have to make compromises. And that is very hard to sell at home, where very often you have already made very strong positions on these issues. I think there is a possibility to use the EU more as a deflection from the national debate, to say that for the sake of European effectiveness, we are working together. And that means we also have to accept certain compromises. But so far, this is not what is happening.
Yeah.
And I think what we actually have a problem with is the political leadership, that we have to have a political leadership, both at national level and at EU level, which is willing to stand up in public for these kind of compromises. If that doesn't happen, if every country in the end will insist on having their own reaction for their own domestic audience when it comes to these crises, we're never going to act together effectively. And that will also then be reflected in our role in the world. We will simply be ignored because we are divided.
So, Herman, this brings us to this question of the state of democracy in Europe. And of course, we haven't mentioned yet the rule of law challenge. President Macron warning very strongly about that in his speech to the European Parliament last week, saying that the promises that we were founded on, the EU was founded on democracy, progress and peace are under threat. In terms of, and I wanted to link this to your point about nostalgic nationalism, but also to hope. Because populists thrive on fear, on insecurity, on deep concerns among the public about where we're going. Are you at the end of the pandemic phase of COVID, hopefully, are you sensing that this sort of retreat, if you like, of the populists during the crisis will be maintained? What is the key here to making sure that as we wrestle with some of these very difficult issues and this nostalgic nationalism you talked about, we don't see a return once the acute phase of COVID is over? How do we, in a nutshell, turn that fear back into hope? What do mainstream politicians have to do? What can we do? Can we do it?
Just that. First of all, populism is there to stay. It's part of the political landscape. The only issue is how strong are they? And then you have to look first to what's happening in the member states. We just had German elections. Janis and Fabian, they know Germany much better than I do because they're Germans. I can only speak about Belgium, but then I'm really an expert. But on Germany, there was a defeat of the extreme right and the extreme left. So is Germany an exception? I don't know, but it was very striking that we had that. We'll see, we'll look of course, at what will happen in France. But there is even a possibility that the two center-right candidates will be in the second round. They will not say that this will happen, but there's a real possibility because there is a division in the extreme right, but it's very striking that they are divided. And leaving the euro and leaving the European Union is not an issue anymore in France, as it was an issue 4 or 5 years ago. The COVID crisis was not the crisis of the populists. It was not their crisis. But what I fear, we have spoken about inflation and energy and all those issues. There can be a general discontent, and their populists can always benefit from that, and rising prices and decreasing standards of living is one of them. Italy is another issue. We don't know what Prime Minister Draghi will, what his destiny will be. Most likely, will become president of the Italian Republic, and then there are chances that we will have in the upcoming year new elections in Italy. But Italy is continuing to surprise us. We had elections 4 years ago. There was a majority of two populist parties, and it ended up with the most pro-European government Italy had in the last decades. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you understand what I wanted to say. So we have to look at what's happening in the individual member states. We'll see what happened in Poland.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hungary.
They will have elections next year, but the prices are rising there. Inflation rate is at 7%. And we'll see what happened in Hungary, where there also are encouraging elements that the opposition at least is now united. I don't know what will happen in those countries, but things are different now than they were a year ago. So populism is there to stay, but we have to see how strong they are and how they can weigh on the political agenda. But overall, the pro-European parties will be the mainstream parties in Europe, and the European process will not be stopped.
Okay. I want to come back to you right at the end for a thought on what whether there is anything the EU can do in terms of portraying that message of hope, of not, as you said, the general discontent. We'll come back to it in a second. Quick thought, because we only have just over 5 minutes left, and I want to end on a message of hope from you, Herman. Hopefully, if you can be optimistic for me.
I was already hopeful.
You are more optimistic, I was going to say. Your assessment of the state of play of populists, I think, gives us all some hope. But whether there's more proactively people can do to counter the risk of a comeback. Janis, for you, that political situation, the right, I mean, Herman saying at the moment, the picture is relatively good. Pro-European parties in the mainstream, populists in retreat or have been. What's your sense of what's likely to happen as we emerge from the pandemic phase of COVID?
First of all, I think it's also important to remember what Herman said. Populism is not a new phenomenon, and it won't go. The question is, how strong or not will it become? And you really need to look into the individual situations in individual countries. Having said that, and that is something, going back also to the start of our discussion today, I think something we had underestimated is the level of uncertainty which COVID-19 has created. And what I mean is at the societal level. People feel very uncertain. They have personal uncertainties on how things will further develop. They have professional uncertainties. A lot of businesses have uncertainty. So the element of uncertainty has structurally increased because of the COVID-19 crisis. And we know that uncertainty raises insecurities, and insecurities is something from which the so-called populists can profit on the left and on the right. So the fact that we have an increased uncertainty feeling among many people is something which you need to counter if you want to avoid populist profiting.
And how do you do it? How do we turn it to hope? How do we avoid?
Yes, but this is a question which cannot be answered generally. That's why I started by saying you need to look into the situation in individual countries. And you need to then ask yourself, so what needs to be done? What at the European level you need to do is you need to ask yourself, how can you collectively play a role as a European Union to counter insecurities? So the discussion we had on energy prices is something where I think more could be done at the European level, which could counter these uncertainties, which then would undermine the opportunities of populists to play the green populism card. This is just one example. So this is a general reflection, but I think you need to translate that general reflection into what it actually means at the national level and how the European level could help.
Thank you. Fabian, quick thought from you and your recipe for turning fear into hope. And just to mention, I don't know whether you can touch on this, Philippe de Book asks about a question I think which is going to come much more to the fore this year. How do we deal with enormous public debts in most EU member states? Review of the Stability and Growth Pact, of course, that debate underway. Back to 60% debt, he asks. I mean, this whole question of the EU's the rules and whether we return to very tough budget rules, which had a very strong implication, and many people saying austerity cannot be part of the answer this time. So it links to the populism debate. A thought from you, and then I'll give Herman the floor at the end, just hopefully to uplift us before we end. Fabian.
You're expecting I won't be uplifting. I think on the question in terms of public debt, I think it is important to keep in mind that post-COVID is not pre-COVID. The world has changed rather fundamentally. And that will also mean we will manage public debt very differently. There is no appetite anywhere in the European Union to go back to austerity measures. So there will have to be a different economic governance, whether that is in terms of changing the rules or whether it's in the way it's implemented. But in the end, it cannot be a return to what was there before.
And your recipe for countering the populists and becoming and having a more positive, hopeful sense, is it possible? Can we do it?
I think it very much depends on what we strengthen within the European Union. I think coming back to something we talked about before, I think domestic politics is a reality. We are not a unitary state. We are a collection of different countries where the leaders in those countries will refer back to their national environment. So the question is, do we catch the British disease, where we basically say we can't do anything together at the European level because it might reflect badly in our domestic debate? Or are we trying to go more down the French hope route of saying we can make France great again through the European Union? I think at the moment, there are different tendencies in the European Union. Some countries are blocking or even trying to sabotage what is happening at the European level. But in the end, there will be the question of what happens in the big countries, what happens particularly between France and Germany in the post-Merkel, probably Macron area. And I think this is where we also need to see some positive moves forward. And the question is, are we going to see that, or are we simply going to go back to a situation where we are only reacting to crisis as we go along, and potentially at some point in time failing to react appropriately?
Thank you. So Herman, a decade of crisis after crisis, we've been buffeted left, right and centre. If we are to go back to the title of our session today, to turn fear into hope after this decade of turbulence, what for you, of all the issues we've discussed this morning, bit of a whistle-stop tour, what will be most important to turn that fear into hope?
Jackie, I'm very grateful that you have chosen this title, Turning Fear into Hope, as the title of our talk. Actually, 40 years ago, I have written a manifesto for my party with exactly that title. So there is a societal dimension in uncertainty. And Janis mentioned it, and I mentioned it already 40 years ago. I used the word Angst, even a very German word. So that's a dimension of our societies. There's even a dimension of our civilizations. I will not elaborate on this. So the only thing I wanted to say is it's not new. But in the meantime, in those 40 years, we built up a European Union with 27. We created the euro. There's so many things happen, even in times of uncertainty, in times of angst. I think that the main issue for the European leaders at national level and at European level, and to some extent they are the same, is that we badly need results in key areas of concern for our citizens. For me, it's the Europe of the results. And I'm speaking now about jobs, I'm speaking about employment, about insecure jobs, about climate change, about pandemic and health, about irregular migration in some countries, about corruption. I'm speaking about responding to military threats coming from outside. So they want results. But there is also an issue of leadership in all this, because leaders tend to raise expectations and then they deliver, but never, most of the time, never let it to the same. Those results of our policies are not in line with what they promised. So management of expectations and real leadership, listening to people and telling the truth to people is from extreme importance. So sure, you have the Europe of the results, but you have also the leadership issue of talking and telling people what they can do and what they can't, and in what kind of time frame they have. There is this leadership deficit, and there is also this democratic deficit, and that really have to work on it. And there, the conference on the future of Europe is a key exercise, and it will not be. There will not be conclusions in April or in May. We will need much more time than that. But tackling the democratic deficit and tackling the leadership deficit is of utmost importance. But if you ask me, how can we, in a convincingly way, a credible way, there's a better word, actually turn fear into hope, is by showing people that all what we promised, all what that we can deliver on it, and not on side issues, but on the key issues on which they're living, their life is built upon.
Thank you.
And no, I'm speaking now in very general terms, Jacki, but that's my message.
But it is that key principle. Don't promise what you can't do, but deliver on what you do promise. Thank you so much, Herman, as always, for sharing your wisdom, your great experience with us. I'm sure we will come back at updates, maybe in the middle of the year and towards the end of the year, to assess where we have got to. With that is all we have time for. Herman mentioned there the conference on the future of Europe. Do join me on Monday for the latest in our conference conversations, a special conference conversations brought to you by the Conference Observatory, of which the EPC is part, along with others. We're going to be hearing from some of the citizens who've been in the panels, who've been ambassadors for their panels, about their experience, how it's been for them, and do they believe it will deliver on what they think it promised to do. So very much linked to what Herman was saying there. That's on Monday afternoon. Please also do take a look at that EPC Outlook paper that I mentioned, produced by the Europe in the World team. Lots of meat to get into there, but it only remains me to thank Janis, Fabian, but particularly Herman, and all of you for joining us. And I wish you a very pleasant rest of the day. Thank you and goodbye.